Welcome back everyone. For today's video we are going to be taking a look at the grand final of the Julius Baer Generations Cup, which is part of the Chess Champions Tour and being played online at chess.com. Now, as we know, Magnus Carlsen has been completely on fire, destroying all of his opponents and leaving a bunch of wreckage in his wake. But today he's playing against Alireza Firouzja in a rematch of the finals of the winners bracket. Alireza did come through. He won a couple of critical matches to make his way back, but there is one problem. Magnus Carlsen, because he was the winner of the winners bracket, he will have to be defeated twice by Alireza in order to not win this event. Now, it's obviously a very tall order, but if anyone can do it, you expect it to be Alireza Firouzja. So let's jump right into the action. So here we go. We have, of course, game number one. Now, the format's same as always. Players are playing a game with 15-minute second, I believe 3-second increment for move number one. It's a 4-game match. Alireza has to win this 4-game match. If he wins this 4-game match, then they will play a reset match with 2 games of 15 plus 3 once again. And if that is tied, you'll have Armageddon. Now, obviously, without spoiling anything, I'll explain the format as we go along. So here we go. Game number one of the 4-game match. Magnus playing with the white pieces. He opens with e4. Alireza plays e5. And we get a pretty standard Spanish opening here with this move d3. Now, those of you guys who have been watching my recaps, there was this famous streamer guy, Hikaru, who actually played the same closed Spanish with d3 against Benjamin Gladura in the World Cup. You might want to check out his video on the GMHikaru channel as it is there. So we get d3 from Magnus. Alireza plays d6, c3, castles, all pretty standard here. Nothing too special, at least in the opening phase, until this move number 11 when Magnus plays this unusual looking move, bishop e3. Now, bishop e3 is normally not the square that you put the bishop on in these positions. Normally, there are a couple of ideas. First of all, white aims to play d4 and build this big white center. This is the first idea. Or you try to bring the knight to f1 and then e3 or g3 first. It's very unusual to bring the bishop out to e3 this early in the game. And I don't know if it's actually a mistake from a pure computer perspective, but I think from a human perspective, it's not the best move because the next couple of moves for black or Alireza are actually quite easy to find. So we get Alireza playing d5, a very, very important move here as black tries to contest the center. You, of course, have D's knights along with the big black center, and black actually has a very nice position here. Magnus plays knight bd2, and now we get h6 being played. Just a simple move to create some lift for the king on h7, but also stop any ideas like bishop g5. I didn't mean to do that. I'm such an idiot. Sorry for the spoiler. Oops, my bad. At any rate, we keep going. So what I was trying to say is that h6 is a very logical move here because down the road, say you get a move like rook b8 and bishop g5 potentially. In this position, white can always try to pressure the knight, which really guards his pawn on d5. So for example, say you get h6 takes, knight e4, bishop e7, bishop b3. Suddenly there's some pressure here towards the pawn on center. Maybe knight f5, bishop on b3 is very, very well placed. And white has perhaps a little bit of an advantage. So when you play h6, you stop bishop g5. So now the knight is always guarding the central pawn, and you create the lift for the king on h7. So now we get knight b3 from Magnus. Alireza plays a5. We get a4, b4. All these moves coming in pretty quickly. At this point, I feel like Alireza has equalized, if not, in fact, potentially claiming an advantage here because he's got a nice center. He's got more space on the queen side, and it just doesn't feel great. This bishop on c2, very, very awkward here behind these pawns, as well as the knight and the pawn. And this is another reason that for beginners, I do not recommend you play the Italian opening very specifically because the structure with d3, c3, and e4 is very common in the Italian. It's very easy to get a bishop on c2 like Magnus has here, which simply is misplaced. So we get knight to h2 from Magnus, pawn trade, we get d4, more pawns come off the board, we get bishop d2, and now Alireza plays this move knight d7, intending to maybe go to b4 with the knight or use the c5 square for his other knight. So we get knight to f3, pressuring the pawn on d4. Alireza plays the move knight f8 here, trying to reroute the knight to e6 where it will overprotect this pawn on d4. So we get rook c1, knight to e6, bishop to b1, and now Alireza plays this move bishop to a3. Magnus goes rook c4, we get queen d6, and now we have this move bishop a2 played after a very, very long think of 3 minutes. Now, up to this point in the game, it's very clear that Alireza is doing better simply because of the time usage and the lack of coordination between the white pieces. The knight on b3 doesn't really have any squares where it's jumping towards. The bishop on b1 is absolutely abysmal behind this pawn wall, and the rook can very easily be attacked by a move like bishop a6, and or black can even take this nice square on b4 for the bishop or for the knight. So it looks really, really bad for Magnus. So he plays bishop a2 with a very simple conceptual idea, which is what Magnus wants to do is, let's just say black plays knight d8, you get knight c1, knight c6, and rook c2, ignoring the actual evaluation because it's not about that. White has this nice bishop on the long diagonal, and suddenly white can even try to reroute this knight maybe to e2 and g3 and f5. So all of a sudden you have this great bishop, you have this nice rook, and your knight is going to g3 and f5, and just like that, white is actually already better. So Magnus ends up playing bishop a2 after a long think here, spending 3 minutes. Now this maybe is not the best move objectively, but here Alireza goes wrong by playing the move bishop to a6. Now this is a mistake because here Magnus can sack the rook after e5, queen d7, and rook takes c6. Now in this position, the computer actually wants us to move bishop b4 with the point that after trading, the knight gets on this bastion square of b4, it hits the bishop, and after bishop b1 and c5, suddenly the pawn on c5 is guarded by the knight, pawn on c5 guards the pawn on d4, and black is significantly better because this bishop a6 idea is incoming to target the rook on c4 or the pawn on d3. So at any rate, Alireza plays this move bishop to a6 after a relatively short thing, and this is a big mistake because after Magnus sacks the rook, we get queen takes c6. Here knight takes a5 is played, whereas knight takes d4 would have been much better. Now the reason that I say that bishop a6 is a big mistake is because one very important theme with blitz and or rapid is when you have a big advantage on the clock, you want to be in situations where your moves are easier than your opponent's moves, especially if you have less time. And up to this point, even after bishop a2, it's not really clear what Magnus's next set of moves are going to be if black were to play bishop b4. Are you going to trade the bishops? Are you going to try to go e5? Are you going to try to move the knight back? It's not really clear what you're doing, whereas in this position suddenly everything starts to flow. But Magnus does not play knight takes d4, which is the absolute best move and would have actually given him a small advantage after takes, let's just say queen g6 for example, and this move rook to e3, activating the rook, lifting it, and all of a sudden there are all kinds of threats towards the black king from this light square bishop and then from this dark square bishop and the rook on g3, and black is actually in a lot of trouble here. Instead, Magnus plays this move knight takes a5 after a 40-second think, and as soon as Alireza played queen d7, Magnus threw his hand up in the air. He's like, why did I just do this? I think Magnus simply missed that queen d7 was a move. I think he expected queen b6, and he thought that after knight c4 here, forking the queen and the bishop, bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop here, that he would be completely fine with this nice light square bishop that always spies this long diagonal. Alas, Alireza plays queen d7, we get queen c2, rook b8, queen c6, we get this trade, rook b6, bishop takes knight, takes, and knight takes pawn. And at this point, Alireza, even though the clock doesn't show it, was I believe ahead by 3 minutes. I think it says 2:51. I think he had a little bit more time than that, but he's ahead by effectively 3 minutes to 27 seconds. So Alireza has 2.5 extra minutes. Magnus is very low on time here, and Alireza also has a much better position. He's got a rook, he's got the 2 bishops here. So with the rook for the knight and the 2 bishops, you expect him to win. But here Alireza spends a lot of time and makes a bad move, playing this move bishop c5 after a 1 minute and 40-second think. Now remember, what I said before is that it's very, very important that you have the easy moves. And as soon as Alireza plays bishop c5, the problem is he burns a minute 40 seconds, but Magnus is able to go boom, boom, pow, and play the next 5 moves pretty much instantly. So we get rook c1, targeting the bishop on c5. Alireza trades, again, doesn't want to trade the bishop here, but if you don't trade the bishop for the knight and you go to say f8, now after knight takes e6, the rook guards the knight, knight's hitting the pawn on c7 and the bishop on f8, and white is doing completely fine. So he decides to take, which is also difficult because as we're starting to see from the transformation, Alireza is burning through his time advantage, but Magnus's moves now are actually turning out to be a lot easier. We get bishop d3, a5 played, bishop guards the pawn, you get rid of the pawn which was under attack, we get rook to a6, and now Magnus plays this awesome move f3. Now at this point I was expecting Magnus to play rook takes c7 instantly, but f3 shows why Magnus is such a great endgame player, because it's a move that was played under serious pressure. He's still down about 15 seconds on the clock, but he finds it anyway, and this move is a really, really good nuanced move, because after rook takes c7, black can go bishop e4, f3, and bishop d5, and with the classic wooden shield here, the bishop on d5, bishop is guarding everything, and black should be able to draw this pretty easily. But when you play f3 first, it stops bishop e4, so black has no obvious move, which again, when players are low on time, it's really, really important. You have your next move, you can play it right away, you just want to play that move instantly. So f3 cuts off any instant move, and now Alireza spent time to play rook b8, and now Magnus gets to eat the pawn on c7, but the bishop does not get to d5 here via e4 or c4, and as such, this pawn on e6 is a massive weakness. So now we get rook b2, Magnus plays bishop c3, rook a2, We got knight b3 here, trying to reroute the knight. I actually thought during the game knight c6 would have been extremely scary with the idea of knight b4 threatening to fork these rooks, but he goes knight b3. We got bishop b5, knight c5, and now after rook c6, trade knight e6. White actually has 3 pawns and a knight for the rook, but with such limited time and the rook actually being an easier piece to move around the board, Magnus is not able to capitalize, and the game ends in a draw. I'll just show you guys the rest. We got rook a3, bishop b1, rook a1, bunch of repetitions here. Knight d4, takes, rook c1, knight d4, rook a1. And now white can no longer save the a pawn. So if you go knight b3, I have rook a3 attacking the knight and the pawn. And if you go knight c6, I just go right back to c1. So Magnus decides to play f4, takes, king g4, king f7. We got a bunch more moves here. Not really going to go into in-depth analysis here. We end up getting to this endgame where white has a knight and 2 pawns versus a rook and 1. But with rook and knight being a theoretical draw, even if white loses the 2 for the 1, there's no way for Magnus to lose. And we get the draw very shortly as Alireza decides to sack the rook for the knight. Could have played rook a1 here, but after knight d4, king f7, and let's just say knight to f3 back, king g6, king f4, even this is still probably a draw after check, because white can always check, go to f5 and hit the pawn, and then if you go forward, I just keep checking every which way. And with the knight held by the pawn or the king, this will be a draw. So Alireza sacks the rook, and the game ends in a draw in this position after all the material comes off the board. So game number 1 ends in a draw. Let's move on to game number 2 now, where Alireza has the white pieces. Now in game number 1, we knew that Alireza was winning at some critical moments. Very tough pill to swallow for him after having that massive time edge and the great position on the board, but maybe he can recover. So we get e4, c5, knight f3, e6. We get a open Sicilian here from Magnus. We get this classic time knot variation where black has this very ugly structure of d7, e6, and c6. Now, there's been a lot of theory. I remember even when I was an up-and-coming player around master level, this line was all the rage. Usually black would play queen b6 or queen c7 here, but bishop b7 was also one of the old lines. So we get bishop e2, c5 played here. We get castle. c5, very logical move, by the way, to open up this diagonal for the light square bishop. Magnus goes queen c7, and now we get knight d6, takes, queen c6, and now this move f3 is played, and here Alireza plays e5. Now, again, without consulting chess base, I can't say this for certain, but I feel like this was a variation that was played, I want to say in the early 2000s. Garry Kasparov was playing a lot of games in this, and I remember that c4, I believe at the time, was considered to be the best move here because it's extremely explosive. However, Magnus plays e5 here, which is definitely not the best move. Now, whether Magnus didn't know the line, whether he was just experimenting, really hard to judge, but he goes for something else with e5. Now, after c4, queen d4, castles, bishop c4, queen d6. White is a little bit better here with the 2 bishops, but black should be relatively okay. So we get e5, c4, and now Magnus plays knight f4, takes, and here he plays this move bishop d3. Now the computer was screaming for this move queen d2 to be played, and I think if Alireza had played this move, it would have been really interesting to see how the game would have continued, because the computer actually just wants to jettison the pawn on f4 by castling and then going rook fe8, bishop to d3, and something like rook e6, trying to argue that even though black is down a pawn here after bishop e4 and queen b6, if you trade and play b3 here, there's like queen b6, rook d1, and rook e8, and even though white has this extra pawn on d6 very weak, black controls the only open file with the double stack, and your queen can go to a5, b4, or a6, and there are all kinds of threats here. So I really wish we would have seen this move, because I think the reason Alireza rejected it was because of g5, but after rook a e1 or rook fe1, castles, for example, white can go bishop to d1, rerouting this bishop to c2 or b3. Probably c2 and e4 is the idea. And after rook h8, bishop c2, computer says that white is much better. It's better than +1 here. So it would have been really interesting to see if Magnus would have played g5 or not, but at any rate we didn't get that because bishop d3 was played in the game. Magnus decides to capture the pawn here. We get rook e1, king d8, a good move from Magnus, not going to f8, because after king f8 and bishop e4, with the queen trade here and the bishops coming off the board, white is actually much better in this position because black cannot activate the rook, king can't come to the center, and so you'll have to push some pawns to activate the king, and you're probably going to lose all your pawns on the queen side in the process. Also, to point out, at d6 there is rook takes c5, so if you take the rook you would lose both of your rooks, and after king e7, rook a5, rook d7, and let's just say rook d4, rook b8, and b3, white is much better with the chain of 3 pawns, and you'll lose the pawn at f4, so technically this should be winning. So we get king d8, bishop f5 played here by Alireza. We get the trade, and now bishop c6. And now it's much different with the king on d8 because the king guards the pawn, but you can slide the king to c7 and bring D's rooks to the center of the board. We get rook e5, and here Magnus plays a5, which is an excellent move. Now, the reason a5 is excellent is twofold. If you were to play, let's just say, a move like h6, the first problem with this line is that after rook c5 and king e7, white can go b4 with the idea of b5 to undermine the bishop on c6, which guards this pawn on d7. And black really can't stop it. You can maybe go rook d8, but after b5, bishop b7, rook c7, we have the kebab on the 7th, and white is simply overwhelmingly winning here. Secondarily, after h6, there's also the idea with bishop d7 takes and rook d5 lining up the double stack and winning the bishop. So when Magnus plays a5 here, it's dual function. First of all, after takes rook d5, there's rook a7 and black has an extra bishop. And secondarily, after a5 rook c5 king e7, you cannot play b4 because the pawn will be captured. So now you can't dislodge the bishop on c6, which guards the pawn on d7. And already here the endgame is petering out towards a draw. So we get bishop e4, rook c8, we get check, king f8, takes, rook d7, rook d8. And now at this point, it's very clear that the players will draw this game. It's simply a matter of time. So we get rook takes a5, takes, king e7. Good move from Magnus to take this rook, because now your rook's under attack, but you're also hanging the pawn on a2. And unless white can get a position with, say, the 3 pawns connected here to push up the board, there's no chance of winning. And the game ends in a draw very shortly after rook g8, rook a2, takes, rook g4, check, king f2, check, king f1, check. And the players just repeat back and forth here. If white were to play king d3 in this position, black can play h5, attacking the rook. If you take the pawn, I take on g2, and after rook h4, rook g5, very simple draw. And if you were to play a move like rook g5, now I can go h4, let's just say h3, and after king f6, rook g4, and king e5 here. If you ever take h4, you hang g2, and there's simply no way to win. So that's why this game ends in a draw after king to f1. So game number 2, pretty slow, boring game that ends in a draw. Again, Alireza had some chances. My perception of this game as well as the match is that Magnus definitely trying to see how far he can push the envelope. See, can he play like positions a little bit worse, much worse? How far can you really push the envelope? All the while testing Alireza's knowledge of opening theory. So let's move on to game number 3. So the match is now tied by a score of 1-1, and we dive into the third game. So we get e4 from Magnus, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Again, we get a standard Spanish here with knight c3. I guess knight c3 is not so much standard. Knight c3 definitely a little bit different. Normally white will play d3 or rook e1. Those are the 2 main moves. So we get knight c3, b5, bishop b3. We get castles, d3, and now we have knight a5 played by Alireza. Now, I could be wrong, and I haven't actually fact-checked this, but I do believe that d6 is the move that Fabiano Caruana played in that fateful, I believe it was the fateful third, maybe it was like the 5th tiebreaker game. Maybe I'm getting the games confused. But the tiebreak game that he did lose to Pragnananta with the black piece, where I do believe it went something like d6, a3, and bishop g4, if I'm not mistaken. At any rate, Alireza plays this move knight a5. Now this is simply a blunder. This loses a pawn in the center of the board, and it's really not clear what Alireza was thinking when he played this move. The only similar comparison I can draw with a knight a5 move where the pawn isn't guarded would be in this situation after rook e1, b5, bishop b3, castles, and I believe it was h3 here where Magnus Carlsen, I believe, played knight to a5 in this position against Jan Nepomniachtchi in the first game of the 2021 World Chess Championship match, where Magnus left his pawn on e5 on pre. That's the only situation that I can think of where you can go knight a5 and simply hang the pawn on e5 though. So when Alireza plays knight a5 here, with white having built this chain of 3 pawns, after knight takes e5, takes, b4, knight e2, rook e8, knight f3, the smoke is cleared, and white is simply up a pawn pretty much for nothing. You've got a great pawn chain. The only issue is that the pawns are stacked on b3 and b2. We get c5, knight f4, d6. Now we get c4 played here. A very nice move from Magnus, basically forcing Alireza to either undouble the b pawns or give Magnus this d5 square for the rest of the game. So we get bishop f8 played here. Magnus plays h3, logical move to stop bishop g4 and create the look for the king. We get a5, rook e1, g6, and now Magnus plays another great move, knight to d5, basically taking the square and forcing Alireza to either trade or just have to deal with this knight. Now Alireza decides to trade the knights if he were to play bishop g7. After bishop g5, there's this very unpleasant pin to deal with, and white is probably going to win. So we get the trade. Magnus takes with the c pawn, of course, because now he has another idea of bringing the knight to c4 via the d2 square. Bishop g7, we get bishop g5, f6 played here. Probably queen b6 is a better move, but I still think that here after queen c2 with knight d2 and knight c4, white has a huge advantage. So we get f6, and now Magnus plays this move bishop f4. Now this move in and of itself is not a bad move, but I think this whole idea of playing bishop g5 certainly was a little bit questionable when we look back, and the reason is because it gives Alireza a very straightforward plan to at least go for the Hail Mary here and try to come up with some counterplay. So we get g5, bishop to e3, and now we get g4 going all in here, and now Magnus very surprisingly trades the pawns on g4. Now this really is surprising to me because I was expecting Magnus to play knight d2, g takes h3, and then something like queen h5 takes a knight c4, and with this great bash of this knight on c4, white is completely winning here. So when Magnus decides instead to trade and go queen c2, yes, white is still better here, but it starts to feel a little bit iffy because you have the double pawns. The pawn on b2 a little bit weak. Black is going to go queen h4, queen f6, and now Magnus has to run with the king to the center of the board with king f1 because he has this sort of this very big pawn structure in the middle of the board that can't really be attacked. So after king to f1, we get queen f6, rook a b1 played here. We get fe4. Alireza goes queen f3 here, which is a mistake. What he should have played was something like rook f8 with the idea of queen f3 or maybe bishop h6 down the road. Like if you get a position like king e2 and bishop h6, suddenly there's a lot of pressure towards the pawn on f2, and even though the computer thinks that white is winning, it feels a little bit scary. Instead we get queen f3. Magnus plays queen d1, we get queen takes queen, rook takes queen, and now a4 is played, and this position has simplified to an endgame once again, where white has one extra pawn on the board, that extra pawn being the double d pawn here, and black can't really break the chain. Takes bishop f4, rook d8, b3 here. You'll notice that the pawn on b3 prevents a c4 break, so you can never attack this. Additionally, white can always attack the base of the black pawn chain. Even ideas like bishop g3, f4, and e5 to break this chain of pawns is available. So for that reason, it feels very hard to play, and I was expecting Magnus to win this game very easily. So we get rook a6, king e2 played, we get rook f8, bishop e3, bishop e5, rook d2, stopping the rook a2 check, and now we get rook f7, rook c2, king f8, and now we have this move d4 being played. Now d4 is an extremely committal move here by Magnus. It's not the move that I was expecting, to be honest, because it simply gives up a pawn, and now at least after takes bishop d2 and h5, black always has ideas like d3. He can push the pawn on the edge. There's rook a2 down the road if you ever move the rook off the second rank, and it just feels a little bit scary. That being said, white is still probably winning. So we get check, king e7, not king to e7, by the way, because after king e7, I believe that white can simply go check, king f6, trade the rooks, go f4, remove the bishop, and then take on b4. And white should be winning here with these 4 pawns versus the 3 pawns and the weak pawns on d6 as well as d4. So we get king g7, rook c2 back from Magnus here to simply stop rook a2. We get rook a7. Now this move I was really confused by when Alireza played it. He used 30 seconds to play it. I didn't understand the reasoning. To me, rook a8 looked like the obvious move, because after rook g1, king h7, rook g5, like in the game, you can now go rook a2, f8 to try and double stack the rooks potentially. Mind you, it's still losing, but it makes more sense because in the game after rook a7, we get check, king h7, rook g5, and now you can't stack the rooks, so you're simply going to lose the pawn at h5, and Magnus is going to coast to victory. Am I right? Well, not so fast. We get d3, king takes d3, rook takes f2, takes, king g6, check, and this is sort of where Magnus starts to go wrong. Now in this position, Magnus is completely winning according to the computer if he had found this nice little nuanced idea of rook h6 check. If king f7, there's rook h7 checking the king, and after bishop g7, you can take, play bishop c3 check, fossilizing the rook on f2. After takes, rook f2, white is simply winning here because you will win this pawn on c3, and then you will have 3 pawns versus 1 after the trades. So rook h6, king g7 is forced, and then there's this nice move rook h3, stopping the check on the second. Rook on c2 stops infiltration on the a file as well, and white is actually winning here because you have the big threat of bishop h6 with the fossil once again. And when black say moves the king to g6 here, you go bishop takes b4, and you're simply up 2 extra pawns here, and you should have no issues whatsoever. So instead, Magnus goes rook g5, we get king h7, rook f5 here, which is a mistake, by the way, because now after rook h2, computer says that white is only very marginally better here, because now there are tricks like rook h3, there are tricks like rook a3 as well to go after the pawn on b3, and it's just not that simple. So we get bishop to e3, and now Alireza blunders with rook h3. Here what Alireza should have played was rook takes rook, king takes rook, and then rook c7 checking the king. And after king d2 and rook c3 for sorry, not rook c3, king g6 here. Black is actually very much in the game. You're going to go rook c3 and take this pawn on b3, and I don't actually think Magnus would have won the game. Computer wants bishop b6 because I think after rook c3 you probably lose because white can sack the rook. Go d6, bishop c7, followed by d7 and d8. But in this position, after bishop b6, you can go like rook b7, bishop b3, rook c7, and again, it's not really clear how white makes progress. Instead, we get rook h3, and now there's the bone crusher tactic with rook to h5, checking the king, because now the bishop will capture the rook, and after takes, bishop a7. Now we're in an endgame with only rook and bishop on the board, and white is going right after the black pawns, which unfortunately are also on the same square as the white bishop. Black's bishop can't touch anything here. So we get rook h3, king c4, rook h4, rook e2 played here, king g6, takes, king g5, king b5, king f4, b4, rook h3, and now bishop b6 is played here, which is a big mistake. Now again, both players very low on time, can't really fault them in this position, but computer thinks that after retreating the bishop to say g1, for example, let's just say rook b3 here, you now have bishop h2 check, and after king f3 takes, d takes e5, rook d2, white will push p, push the pawn down the board and win the game. And if you were to take the rook on e2 after takes, king d3, white can now go bishop c5, king e4, d6, rook d3, king c6, and again after king e5, b5, white is running with the pawns. You're pushing p, the wide peoples will win the game for white. So Magnus plays bishop b6, and now after rook b3, it's actually not clear whether white is winning anymore, because now you can't just move the king up and push the pawn up the board, and your e4 pawn is under serious threat here, because after king f3, the rook and the pawn will both be attacked. So here Magnus goes bishop c7, king f3, we get rook c2, king e4, king c6. Now this is where the advantage really starts to go out the window. Computer wants king c4 to guard both pawns, but with limited time, king c6 makes perfect sense. And here Alireza takes the pawn on b4, which is a big mistake. What Alireza should have played was move king to d3 first, attacking the rook, and after rook c1 here, black can now go bishop b2, attacking the rook. Let's say move the rook away, and after takes check. Let's just say bishop c5. Black can go bishop e5 here, and down the road at some point white will have to push the d pawn, and once we get to this endgame with rook and bishop versus rook, this is a theoretical draw. Now it's not to say that Magnus might not win it, but it is a theoretical draw. So instead we get rook b4, bishop takes d6, and now Alireza trades the bishops, which loses the game. Computer, I believe, still thinks that king d3 is a draw, because after rook to c1, king d2 takes, king takes, bishop d6, bishop f6, bishop f4, king c2, d6, king d3, d7, king e4. This is a theoretical draw according to table bases. White cannot make progress and win the game, even though the weak engine on chess.com gives white a big advantage. So king d3 would have drawn the game. Do I think Alireza should find it? Absolutely not in this situation. Maybe one move earlier it's possible to find king d3 if you have more time, but in this position it's simply impossible to find it here, and Alireza blunders by trading. The reason he did this is since he didn't see king d3. If you move the rook away, there's rook e2 check, and after king d4, rook e5 check, king d7 check, king e6. White simply has a bishop, a rook, and a pawn versus a rook. Easy win here. And if you don't want to move the rook, you have to take the bishop if you don't see king d3. So Alireza trades the bishops, but now after rook b6 and king c7, he resigns the game, because when you move the rook away after d6, d7, simple rook and pawn versus rook endgame, which is winning for white. So huge win for Magnus here. He takes a lead by a score of 2-1, and we go to game 4. Magnus with black pieces, all he needs is a draw to advance, or not advance, sorry, win the whole thing. So we get e4. Magnus again decides to play his time on off Sicilian, and here Alireza plays b3, trying to mix it up. So we get b3, d5, bishop b5, bishop d7, trade, we get castles, knight f6, rook e1, bishop e7, queen e2 here, and this is really where the game begins in earnest, because Alireza has neglected his development on the queen side, but he's trying to prevent Magnus from castling his king out of the center. So Magnus has an issue here, because there's no way to guard the bishop easily. If you castle, you hang the bishop and lose the game, and if you go king f8, you can no longer castle. If you go knight g8, you can't castle, and you're retreated the knight, so this is a disaster. So we get rook c8 here from Magnus, a very inspired move here, and the idea is actually quite unique. After say bishop b2, black intends to play rook c6, and let's just say you play knight c3. There's now rook to e6, breaking the pin on the e file, and after say queen f1, takes, castles, not king f8, castles, black is very much in the game. So we get bishop a3 here, which is a very nice move from Alireza with a very deep concept. If you try to play rook c6 with the same rook e6 idea, white can go knight to d4, attacking the rook here, can't go to e6 without being captured, and after takes, bishop takes e7. This is a complete disaster. Black is in a lot of trouble. If you go say rook a6, now I have knight to f5 attacking the bishop on e7, and if you play rook e6, now I have knight takes g7 forking the king and the rook, and black will lose very soon. So here Magnus plays this amazing move a6 after about a 3-minute thing, and this is simply a move that I am just in awe of. And the reason I'm in awe of this move is because it's a move that does absolutely nothing. But what Magnus realizes here is that white actually doesn't have obvious moves to try and keep piling more pressure towards the bishop on e7. If you play this move knight d4 here to go knight f5, black can very commonly play g6, stopping knight f5, and your knight has no squares to go to. And if you play a move like knight c3, now I play b5, and the pawn avalanche is pushing your bishops and your knights backwards, and you're not going to be able to stop the avalanche. In fact, here the computer thinks that white is already in a lot of trouble. So because of that, Alireza plays the move c4 instead. Magnus plays knight f8 here, does not play d4 because now white takes, and white simply is 1-1 pawn and will win the game. So we get knight f8 here from Magnus. Now he has the idea of knight e6 or knight g6 to castle the king out of the center. Get knight e5, knight g6, we get knight c3 here. Now this was a mistake. Computer really liked d4 here, trying to put even more pressure in the center of the board here, and black still cannot castle because after castles, takes queen e7. Once again, black will lose a piece. Instead, we got knight c3, d4, get knight a4, king f8, and here Alireza plays the move queen f3. Very natural move, but not the best move. Knight d3 here would have been stronger to target the pawn, and after b6, b4, white has a substantial advantage. Fortunately for Alireza, even though he misses the opportunity with queen to f3, Magnus plays this move bishop d6 here, forcing Alireza to find knight d3 and b4. The reason being that if you were to trade the knights after takes, now your h2 pawn is under attack. If you were to play h3, suddenly after b5, your horse or your bishop on the edge of the board are going to be dead. If you take on c5, you simply lose material. Black is an extra horse. And if you move the knight to b2, after b4, you lose the bishop. And if you don't move the knight, well, takes. If you don't move the knight, you lose the knight. If you move the knight, you lose the bishop. You're going to lose one of the two, and that's just life. So because Alireza can't trade the knights, the only available square for the knight is d3, and now after b6 he has to find b4, because if you don't go b4, say you play a move like g3, after a5 here, which stops b4, all of white's pieces are completely misplaced. Knight on d3 is not really doing anything here. The pawns really prevent the knight from going to b4, can't go to e5 or f4. Bishop on a3 is on a horrible diagonal that's walled in by the pawns. You go to b2, you're still walled in by the pawns. If you go to c1, you have the knight and pawn, so you can't develop, so you still need something like knight b2 and then d3 just to get the bishop out this way. So there are a lot of issues for white potentially in this position, but as I said, he's very lucky because in this position, if Magnus had played the move b6, creating the chain, white doesn't get any of these knight d3 b4 ideas at all, but in the game he does. And Alireza does play b4 here. We get the trade on b4, king g8, queen b7, nice move, hitting the pawns on b6 and a6. We get rook b8, queen a6 here. Now computer wanted queen a7 because after h5 you have this nice trick with bishop e7, and you have this double stack slash kebab on the 7th rank, and apparently white is close to winning here. Alas, Alireza plays like a human and takes the pawn, but now Magnus gets to activate the rook in a very nice fashion with h4 and rook h5, and so black actually has manually castled the king by hand, but the rook on the 5th rank will be able to go to squares like f5, g5, or e5 here, and with the knife coming to f4, it feels quite dangerous. So we get knight b2, h4, h3 played here. Of course, you don't want to allow black to get h3, g3, because down the road there are ideas with lollies on g2. You could also get lobster pincered as well, so it's just not what you want. So Alireza plays h3, but the drawback to h3 is now if black ever can get knife to f4, and you can't ever kick the knight with g3 because you hang the pawn on h3. So we get h3, knight f4 is played, and now we get queen b5, and here Magnus makes a surprising mistake. Again, players low on time, hard to really expect perfection, but rook h5, despite looking really natural, is a slight mistake here. What Magnus should have played was rook to h6, going for rook g6 and using the knife and the rook to attack. And after queen f5, knight e6 here, black has rook h5 or rook g6. Either way, the queen is very awkward here. Let's just say knight d3, rook h5, queen f3, and queen c7. Rook is pretty active on the 5th rank here. c4 is weak. You can bring the rook to the center, and it's not really clear how much better white actually is. At any rate, we get rook h5, rook e5. Magnus now goes queen c7, rooks come off the board, and now these knights are really dangerous on h5 and f4. In return, for the extra white pawn on c4. And as I've said a million times, and this will be the millionth and first time, a knight on f4 is worth at least a pawn, according to Gary Chess, the famous inventor of this great game. So we get rook to e1 here, trying to claim the open e file. We get queen b7. Now we get queen g5 played here. Magnus goes queen c6 with the idea of playing rook to e8, all the while keeping an eye on both of these pawns and stopping bishop d6. Say you go queen a8, bishop d6. Spaghetti-o, you're going to lose some material and lose the game. So queen 6, very multi-purpose move, stops bishop d6, targets both the pawns on c4 and g2, and you have rook e8 available as well. So here we get d3 from Alireza, trying to guard the pawns and reroute this bishop to harass these two knights on h5 and f4. And here Magnus makes a mistake by playing rook e8. What Magnus was supposed to play in this position is this move pawn to b5 here. And the reason that Magnus is supposed to play the move pawn to b5 here is to try and rip open the b file. So Magnus is supposed to try and rip open the b file here, and after bishop d2, b takes c4, let's just say takes, and rook b2. White is still a little bit better here in this position because white will probably end up being up one pawn maybe after queen d4, but again, there are great chances for black to survive. At any rate, Magnus plays rook e8, low on time. We get the swap, bishop d2, and now it looks like Magnus is actually going to lose the game because both of these knights are really, really weak on the edge of the board, and Magnus now blunders with this move queen e2. We get takes. You get queen to d8 check, a very nice move from Alireza. King h7, the yo-yo check, as well as the classic right triangle here. And now in this position, Alireza, when the dust settles, is simply up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4. Two pawns. He has two extra pawns here in a queen and pawn endgame, and he should win quite easily. So we have more moves coming in here. We got the c5, b5 here, and now Alireza plays c6. Now this is a move that is winning in the position, but is a move that I consider to be truly insane. Along frankly with queen b8. Like here, I probably would have just played a4. But once we get to this position, this move is truly insane because if white plays queen f4 here, attacking the pawn on d4 and f7, all the while guarding the pawn at f2 and supporting c6, c7 up the board, this is hopeless. After queen takes a2, white can go c6, queen c2, sorry, not queen c2, something like queen to e6, because queen c2 would actually hang the pawn on f7. And after queen to e6 here, white can go c7. Let's say you play queen to d7, for example. There's queen h4 check, king g7, and queen d8, and white will win this game in the next couple of moves. The other reason this is so critical as well is that after queen f4, you do not lose this pawn. So your king is always going to be very safe with these three pawns around it. Whereas in the game after c6, queen f2, we get queen d6, queen c2, c7, and now queen c1 being played. White is still winning here. But the problem is the queen covers the squares and spies the pawn, all the while threatening to go to f4 and check the king. So it's very hard for white to actually move the queen because you cannot yield the square on f4 here. So now the black queen is placed perfectly, and it's very, very tricky to win this position. So here Alireza plays a3. Now the correct move to have played would have been h4 to stop g5 here, and this is actually winning very easily here because black is essentially in Zugzwang. If you were to move the king to g7, I can take the pawn with check. If you move the king to h6, I have queen f8 check, and then I get a second queen. Same thing applies to king g8 check, king g8, queen d8, or king h8, queen d8. So you can't move the king to any of these squares here, so you can't move the king. Can you move the queen? Not really, because if you play something like queen c2, now I can go queen to d8 because you no longer have the queen f4 check available, and I'll queen on the next turn. So you can't really move the queen, you can't move the king. If you play f5, I check and make a queen anyway, and I win the game. So black is effectively in Zugzwang after h4, whereas after a3, g5, now suddenly it's not so easy to win because now black can play f6 or king g7. Black suddenly has all kinds of space on the king side. So we get queen e5, king g6, queen e4, king h6 here, queen e5, king g6, and now Alireza blunders away the game with this move, queen to d6. In this position, the only way to keep the winning chances intact were with h4. Keep in mind, both players very low on the clock as well, so not easy to expect perfection. But the reason this is apparently winning is after takes. You're supposed to play g4 here, and the computer says it's just winning. So if you take with the queen, and I guess if you go to any of the squares on the h file, there's check with the classic right triangle, and white wins the game. f5, same thing. If you go to f6 here, there's queen d6. And if you go to g7 here, there's queen takes d4, and there are going to be more right triangles everywhere, and white will win the game. But is h4 realistic with 8 seconds on the clock? Absolutely not. In fact, I don't think Magnus himself would play h4 here. H4 with the idea of g4 is simply astounding. So this is why I'm so critical of Alireza not playing queen f4, because if he had played queen f4, there'd be zero risk. Instead, we get queen d6, f6, queen g3, king f7. And in this position, the game is effectively a draw because white cannot improve. You cannot move the queen up the board. You cannot push h4. You cannot push g4 because then I start checking you every which way. And it should be a draw. So we get h4, takes, queen e6, king g6 played. Alireza goes king h3, queen h1, queen h2, queen c1, queen e6. We get a bunch of repetitions here in this position. And here after queen e2, we get this move c8 knight. Now this position is still quite tricky because Alireza is trying to run the king up the board. So you get queen e2, knight, check, king e4. Not queen h2, by the way, because after king e4, the knight does guard the queen. So you got check, king e4, and now Magnus blunders with this move queen to e2. Now both players super low again. Blunders are going to happen. But if Magnus had played queen f5, checking the king and attacking the knight, after king d4, queen takes 8, game ends in a draw. Nothing more to write home about. That's all she wrote. GG, why not? Instead, we get queen e2, takes, check, king d5, check. And here Alireza plays king e6, queen h3. Here takes, king h5, queen e5, king g4. And now inexplicably Alireza plays queen takes b5. Alireza, if he had played queen e6, would have forced queens off the board. And with the d pawn running, white wins the game immediately. Alas, he doesn't do that. He takes the pawn. And now, even though this is winning for white, the show goes on. I'm not really going to explain the moves, but there are a couple critical moments here. So this position is winning. Eventually we get to this point here with d6 takes where the game goes on, and right around here actually after king f7, this position would have been a draw if Magnus plays king d5 here, because after d7 black can just start checking on this right triangle. And if you ever go to e8, there's always going to be queen g8, queen f8, queen e6. If you go king d8, I start checking this way. I just keep checking you all over the board, and then you have no way out. And again, it's the same thing where I just keep checking you every which way. No way to escape the checks, and the game is a draw. Instead, we get check, king g7, and eventually, after a very long continuation here, sorry, actually, there's one more point here. In this position, one more moment here, king b5 also would have been a draw here. I think it's after king e7, there's king to a6 here. Very, very dank concept. I think the reason it's a draw is because the king on this queen side will shield the white king from being able to run towards the b file here down the road, and so you can keep checking on the long side with your black queen. But Magnus goes king c3, and eventually Alireza does win this game. It's a marathon, so I won't explain all the moves, but eventually Alireza is able to start pushing the pawn. Eventually he's able to get it to where the king is safe. There are no checks towards the king. Starts checking, and eventually here we get a position where after all these checks, queen f6 is played, check, king f8, check, king g7. Now black cannot check anymore, because if you go queen g4 with the right triangle, then I have queen g6, you trade the queens, I get a new one and win. And after queen b7, we get queen d4, king h1, and king h6, queen c6, king g5, queen b5, king to h4, and now the queen covers all the checks on the fourth rank. King is safe on h4. You make a queen on the next turn, and you win the game. And Alireza does win this game after this with king g5. Does not take the queen, because even though white has 2 extra queens, this would be stalemate, and you would lose the match. So after king g5 is played on move 130, Alireza wins this marathon game when all is said and done, and he does force an Armageddon game. So let's go to the Armageddon game. Now, in the Armageddon game, the format is quite straightforward. Players bid for their amount of time. So the player who bids less will get the black piece and draw odds, but the drawback is there's no increment in this game. So if you get low on time, you can get flagged 100%. So Alireza, I believe, bid 9 minutes and 10 seconds. Magnus, I think, bid 8 minutes 56 seconds. So Magnus gets the black pieces and draw odds. So Alireza plays e4. We get c5, knight f3, e6, b3, a6, and g3. Now, in my opinion, I think this was a very poor opening choice from Alireza objectively, because he's playing something that Magnus had just faced in the previous game. So Magnus obviously is going to have pretty straightforward development against this setup. And I don't think it's just, I think it's just a bad choice, simply because in Armageddon, the player with the black piece, the big disadvantage they have is that in the opening, if they have to use time, they can be under time pressure very early. But if you can blitz out the first 15-20 moves, very oftentimes you're gonna have something like 7-8 minutes for the entire game, and there aren't going to be that many critical moments unless you get into some kind of tricky like rook and pawn endgame or something of that nature. So I don't really like the opening choice. That's also why in the first Chess Champions Tour event of the year, when I played Magnus, I think I did something like a reverse King's Indian. I mean, I don't remember the exact moves. I think I did a recap of it, but I played something like a reverse King's Indian, where eventually I was able to get a quick kingside attack here. And I think at some point I was actually better in that game, but it kept all the pieces on the board. The position was closed, and I had clean attacking ideas. Even if objectively it wasn't great, Magnus did not get to play a lot of quick moves. Now, unfortunately, that game would end in a draw. I was not able to win, even though I had some chances. But I do feel in Armageddon, it all comes down to the opening. So when we get to this position after d5 takes bishop g2, the problem is that Magnus gets very quick development here, gets his king out of the center of the board, gets development here, king out of the center, knight here on c6, pawns on c5 d5, bishop can go to g4 f5, and the opening, I would say, has been a very, very clear failure from Alireza as far as I'm concerned, because even though the position is fine, Magnus gets to play all these quick moves before having to think. So we got knight a4, takes, Magnus plays bishop g4 quickly, and here Alireza blunders with knight to e2. What Alireza should have done here is play this move knight takes knight, pawn takes, and queen d3, but even here after rook e8, bishop b2, and something like bishop b4, or even bishop d6 here, Black is completely fine. He's got a nice solid center. He can play queen d7, aim for bishop e2, go knight d7, knight e5, and in general the plans are too easy to play without having to think at all. So Alireza instead plays knight e2, which is a bad move. Magnus now goes rook e8, and the reason this is a bad move is because you're walking into a pin here, and now additionally Black is going to be able to play d4 d3, maybe use the open e file, maybe use the c file as well, and White has all kinds of issues. So Alireza plays f3, we get bishop d7 here, and now to compound matters, the bishop on g2 very passive. You go f4, it's going to be some knight g4, b5, queen b6, or bishop c5, queen b6, and with knight g4 combined, there are a lot of issues on these dark squares and this diagonal. So we get bishop e3, b5, knight c3, rook c8 played, bishop f2, bishop to a3, and now we get this move rook to b1 being played by Alireza, and Magnus now goes knight b4. Now at this point it's very clear that Magnus is in great shape because he has the two rooks on the two open e and c files, or ideas like bishop f5, and the knight's in front of his pawn on c2, and d5 is actually not a weakness at all, so it's going to be very hard for Alireza to do anything. So we get rook e1, h5 played here. Now the reason Alireza plays Magnus goes h5 is twofold. In this position, I really want to see this move g4 being played to push for g5 to activate the bishops. If you can get some like h6, h4, g5, maybe there's threats like f4, open up the diagonal. And even though this is very bad for White, I feel like you're going to get some chances perhaps if Magnus is not super precise. And again, even though it's not right in a must-win situation, it's not about right or wrong, it's about where there are possibly chances. So after rook e1, h5, g4 is out of the equation, and now there's also bishop f5, so it feels very tricky. So we get queen d2. Now Magnus plays knight takes c2, which is an excellent move, not the absolute best move, but what it does here is with Magnus having 5 minutes on the clock, he's simplifying. So after takes and b4, knights are coming off the board, then rooks are coming off the board, and Magnus has more than enough time here, and he should not be in any danger. So we get bishop b4, bishop d4, Magnus plays queen a5. Now also I might point out that here the other big issue is that while Alireza was thinking, Magnus was thinking on his time. So Alireza used like 35 seconds here, but during those 35 seconds Magnus has calculated the next sequence of 5 moves, and the game is just really not in doubt here. So we get this queen a5, rook e3, trade, queen a2. Black's up a pawn here. Mind you, it's not the best situation in terms of trying to win the game, but you're taking risk of losing out of the game. So we get h3, queen b3, g4 played here. Again, you could always trade the bishop for the knight and play this endgame here, but in this position, after rook h5, check, king h2, rook c2, it's going to be a draw because I'm threatening bishop f1, and whenever you go back, I just keep checking you, and there's just no way to escape the box. So we get g4, queen c4 played by Magnus, queen d2, d4 here. Another move that not the best move, but a very, very pragmatic move because Magnus forces queens off the board. If you take with the queen, for example, I'll just trade, and when Alireza takes with the bishop, there's queen c1, queens come off the board, Magnus down 30 seconds, but he has an extra pawn in an endgame, and there's just no way that he's going to lose. So we get king h2, rook c2, rook e7, bishop b5, we get rook e1, knight d5, bishop e5 played here to stop knight f4, f6, bishop d6, and now we get this move knight to e3, which is a very nasty move from Magnus, because when Magnus plays this move for a split second, you might think that it's like a mouse slip because you win a free knight, but after rook e3, bishop f1, Black wins the bishop on g2, and now we're in an end game where we have opposite colored bishops, 4 versus 3, and now there's just no hope for Alireza. We get king f4, rook d2, bishop c5, d5, rook e8, bishop f8, g5 here. Again, bishop takes h3. Maybe Magnus would have won this, who knows, but he doesn't need to, so he goes g5, king g3, rook d2, we get f4, h4, king f3, we get takes, bishop e7, bishop g2, king e3, rook to d1, king f2 here, h3, bishop f6, and now we get g takes f4 here. Last really tricky moment of the game, because if you play h2 after f5, white is actually going to be checkmating the king on h7 in the next couple of moves. So we get gf4, bishop e5, rook d2, king e1, and now Magnus plays the move f3, which is just Magnus being Magnus, and it's doing, I would say, some kind of like trolling here, because even though Magnus could still probably win this game if he were to play rook a2, by playing f3 he's trying to force an opposite color bishop's endgame where Alireza cannot win, and Alireza here basically decides to throw the game. He figures, whatever, I'd rather lose than make the draw. So he get rook e7, king g8, he takes f2, and now he plays g5 here. Rook to g7 would still draw after king f8, rook g5, queen here takes, let's just say bishop e4 here, and the reason this game would be a draw is that in this position you can always sack the bishop for the pawn on h2 down the road, because it's the wrong color queening pawn on a6 here. So there's really basically no way for black to win. But Alireza, as I said, a draw, a loss, it's all kind of the same thing. He decides to play g5, we get f1, g6, queen f2, king d3, queen f5, and here Alireza resigns the game against Magnus, because when you move the king, black takes the pawn, no checkmate ideas, and black is a queen for a rook, queen and a pawn for a rook I should say, and there's nothing you can do. So Alireza prefers to lose this game rather than make the draw. Regardless of the result though, either way, Magnus does survive the Armageddon game with the black pieces. He gets the win, and he does win this fourth event of, I believe, of the Chess Champions. No, sorry, this is the fifth event. He does win the fifth event of the Chess Champions Tour, the Julius Baer Generations Cup. Very, very impressive performance from Magnus outside of today, I would say. I got the feeling today he was not at his best. He took a lot of chances trying to see where Alireza's strengths and weaknesses lie. But even today, when Magnus was not at his absolute best, was in some danger in the first couple of games, and even in the fourth game where he was able to swindle what should have been a clean loss into a drawn endgame before blowing it again, even when he's not at his best, he still finds a way to win, which shows that Magnus is an incredibly resilient player, and even when he's not at his best, he's still going to be better than pretty much everybody on this great planet that we call Earth. So at any rate, Magnus wins as usual. I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't. Tomorrow the next big event on chess.com begins, which I will be participating in. That of course is the Speed Chess Championship. I was thinking what SEC stood for a second. I just sort of glitched. Speed Chess Championship. So I will be playing that. I might try to do a recap of my match and other matches as well. But it does start tomorrow. I do play against Yu, so hopefully I can do a recap of that match for you guys. But once again, hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back very, very soon with some more great YouTube-only content. And just enjoy the rest of your weekend, you guys. See you. Bye.